It's a simple and common and well-known fact that all model locomotives don't actually have real prime movers like a real diesel engine or real steam boilers like a steam engine inside them. They have decoders and electric motors that propel them along on the tracks. But here's a question no one ever seems to really ask, or at least not in most cases. Well, how do you model the actual prime mover inside the locomotive? This has to be one of the biggest issues no one's asking a question about, particularly with railroads such as short lines, which have to keep their budgets down, and they do this by buying the older equipment and fixing it up. Or going to scrap yards or locomotive strippers, if you will, to find the parts they need for them. Needless to say, because of the rarity of these parts and the difficulty in finding room to store them, these railroad parts usually wind up all over the place on the railroads itself, and particularly prime movers. That's where this part comes in from Phantom Hobbies, and that's the subject of this review. This company has started doing what a lot of model railroaders have been begging for without really realizing it. They're producing prime movers built to specific specifications in the United States. This is possible through the miracle of 3D printing. The prime mover itself, as you see, is actually a pretty decent deal. It comes in a plastic bag, which I might add appears to have been packed by hand by a person that actually works at the company, something you don't get anymore. The detailing of the part itself is pretty amazing, especially considering how small this outfit is. The plastic is a bit on the greenish side. Usually it's a lot darker green. You can almost get away with this. In fact, I kind of did, if I'm honest. I'm already in the process of making another project with this. I'll tell you more about that later. And you don't just get the prime mover. If we take a look inside the plastic bag, in addition to a fully assembled prime mover, they throw in an extra block as well as an extra generator portion. You can paint these essentially any way you like and either make them as spare parts or just rusty old parts to put out in front of your engine house. So for $15, that's actually a pretty good price. And as we see with this next picture, this product line is not a one-trick pony for this company. While that engine was a 251 16-cylinder, this particular engine is a 244 16-cylinder. And I must say the detail is highly impressive, with the cylinders, turbocharger, valve guides, everything all in place. It's just really pleasant to look at. And in case you haven't guessed it, yes, this is the same 16-cylinder 244 prime mover I used in my Alco PA documentary. This picture is actually highly appropriate as I've discovered this company looking for a picture of this particular engine to put in that documentary. As I mentioned before, while the one part does come fully assembled, it is not painted. So let's go ahead and do a little painting here. As you see, I set my outdoor workbench up, if you will, which is literally a bench. I went ahead and set up for painting with some Testors gray paint to handle the fully assembled prime mover, and some rust-colored paint to paint the extra prime mover parts included. As you can see, the other part of the prime mover comes disassembled, which is the incomplete one, with a separate generator and an extra block. So if you see parts in your fully assembled prime mover, don't freak out. That's just how they're assembled. You can put these back together if you wish, but in all honesty, and if I'm honest, basically most companies would separate them out to use as spare parts when they're sitting in their boneyard and or outside their engine houses. So that's actually a pretty realistic way of dealing with them. At the same time, it makes it easier to hit all those little nooks and crannies when you paint everything. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the painting. I'll start with the two parts of the non-assembled prime mover first, the block and the generator. Again, these are going to get painted rust, followed by some gray highlights to show that these parts may have been good at one point but have been sitting outside for quite some time. Again, railroads don't actually clean up their acts, and having them in this sort of condition is exactly what you want. One of the things I found a little challenging is to get the paint inside those holes for the cylinders right there, but not allowing the paint to bubble up and block the view inside. I wound up having to go over these with a micro brush later on, as we'll see as we go along here. And here's some of that footage of me actually going over with the fine micro brush thing and going over those little holes and making sure I get all the paint where I wanted it. Again, this is kind of tedious to get all these little jobs and to cover every little bit, but the idea is the more you do, the better it's going to look. So it really pays off to really go in there and get every little detail right now, because the product will look, or the end finished project will look a lot better once you're done with it. And next I'll move on to painting the actual prime mover itself, the fully assembled one, gray, which is essentially what these prime movers would look like when they come back from being rebuilt. Again, nothing much to say here. I went ahead and used, in this case, a micro brush, having learned from my earlier attempts with the rust. I was able to fix that up just by going over it again, but I figured do it right the first time with this particular brush and just, get into all the nooks and crannies. Again, spend a little time here, cover every last bit of that plastic to get the best possible result, and you'll thank yourself later, because if not, it's going to drive you nuts. Those little spaces tend to be exaggerated by the green plastic, especially when they're contrasted with the gray paint. Now, as I was painting these prime movers and getting them all set to be used, I began to wonder, well, what was I going to do with them? Just leaving them kind of fully painted and sitting outside an engine shed would look lame. As again, if one were to have, or a railroad I should say, were to have these things rebuilt, they sure as heck wouldn't leave them sitting outside in the elements to rot away. So anyway, I got to thinking as to what I could do with them, and I came up with a very simple idea, and very unique idea, which I'd been actually thinking about for quite some time. I just didn't realize I had all the parts to do it. That was to make a custom flat car with some tie-down chains for these things to sit on. I then realized I even had a flat car to get started with. This is a flat car I acquired at a train show about a year or two ago. As you can see, I got it really cheap for 11 bucks. It's a Bachmann Silver Series flat car with the metal wheels. My preference were rail holding. Anyway, I went ahead and grabbed the prime movers, which I took one last inspection of, and as you can see, they came out really nicely. I did do a little fine detailing. I did notice they were a little bent up. I don't know if that was from the sun or anything else. And one last close shot of the actual flat car itself. And at this point, I took the flat car out and decided to try positioning the prime movers on it. I decided to enhance the center of gravity as much as possible, even though these don't weigh very much, to keep them as close to the center as possible to maximize that. Again, I'd never done this before, so I was just kind of trying to get a feel for it. I vaguely remember seeing one of these in real life, or at least a model of them, where the generators were facing each other. Again, I'm not sure of how that should be, but just how I did it. Then the next issue I had to deal with was what kind of tie-down chain to use. Again, this is an obscure little product that no one thinks much about. I had that A-line products, which is also made in the US, and then I had this scale-like product, as you see there, also made in the US. The difference between the two of them is the scale-like is a brass chain, whereas the A-line is a black painted chain, and I guess both would be accurate. In the end, I would decide to go with the brass painted chain once I finally figured out exactly which position I wanted to put these prime movers in. Again, the trick here is to try to keep them as well balanced as possible. Again, I wanted this car to be able to take tight turns and not roll over, hence the reason why I went with the Silver Series, is I've had good luck with them, and especially in tight areas. I would go with plastic zap glue, which is my sort of go-to for dealing with painted objects that I want to attach with adhesive. And so I went ahead and pulled the scale-like chain out, as I had decided by this point to go with it. Again, you can tell this is a really small mom-and-pop-like outfit, making these sort of obscure parts that no one really thinks of. You can buy plenty of flat cars, you can buy plenty of sort of detail parts for them, but tie-down chains are kind of tricky to come by, especially brass ones. Prime movers in particular as well, that I had these again built in the US, nice little touch again, things you can't normally find. And he dug these chains out and decided to go ahead and do a couple of test fits. I also decided one last time to compare them with the black chains, as you can see here from A-Line products. And after a while of hemming and hawing, again I decided to go with the brass ones. To get started, I took the full length of chain and simply put it over the top of the prime mover the way I wanted to place it. I then carefully judged the length to see exactly how much I would need, giving myself distance on both sides. As again, the way the tie-down system on this flat car works is you see those holes in the flat car, you literally feed the chain through that, and that's how it locks in place. So in order to make that work, you have to give it a little bit excess on both sides of the chain when you do a tie-down. Anyway, you see it zooming in a little bit there to give you a better shot. After tweaking it a few times, I then cut it to length. For this procedure, I just used a standard pair of wire snips. They cut right through the chain without much of a problem at all. Again, making sure to leave a little bit of excess on both sides, so I could again feed them through those holes on the side and glue them into place later on. Again, the prime mover has not been glued yet down to the flat car. I was just roughly testing everything to see how it would fit. And again, I repeated the procedure to attach the second tie-down chain, found a place I like to run it down. In the end, I chose the generator just to try to maximize the length, as I wanted to try to use one package of chain to fill the hole, to do both prime movers, I should say, in place. So I went ahead and just found the length of it and went ahead and laid it in place, and again cut it down once I got the size just the way I wanted it, making sure the chain remained taut. Once I was sure I had the prime movers down on the flat car the way I wanted them, it was time to secure them. Again, I applied the glue liberally toward the center, and as far to the center as I could get it. Take your time with this step. The less overspray you have, the more convincing it will look, and the more happy you'll be with the end result. Anyway, basically not too much to this, just apply it in the center of the car, and as far to the center as you can get it, as long as you don't go too far that the prime mover actually is something to sit on and attach to that glue. It's a bit of a pain to get it just right, but again, taking your time with this kind of stuff really makes a big difference in the end product, as you can see there. And then as you see, I went ahead and repeated the procedure with the other prime mover, just applying the glue gently to the flat car itself, making sure I had a good amount down before I did anything else, and then I simply placed the prime mover atop it and let it sit and dry before I applied the chains. Again, it's critical that the prime movers be dried in place, as you don't want them to move around when you're doing the chain. Also, to make sure that the chain itself will line up with the holes, so I had to kind of take a visual reference point of that. Admittedly, I may have kind of goofed on it, but as it turns out, it didn't make much difference. But again, you want to make sure that they're in the right position to line the chain up. You can usually just kind of compensate by moving the chain back or forth a little bit to make it fit. And now with the prime mover securely adhered to the flat car itself, it was time to take those chains I'd cut to length before and place them in position. Again, I measured these as I went along. I know the shorter ones were to go over the generator, the longer ones were to go over the prime mover itself, preferably toward the back. It took a few attempts to really get it to where I thought it looked realistic, and the idea being that you want to have a chain on either side so the prime mover couldn't slide around, even though these chains are actually just decorations. Anyway, after messing around and getting the positions just the way I wanted to, it was time to secure them into position. One final note, you want to make sure the chain is taut to a certain extent at least, so it looks like it's actually doing a job. That's another thing I was very careful to make sure that when I, as you notice, when I cut it, that the chain was in fact tight to where it needed to be, so it looked like it was actually holding the prime mover down. As it turns out, just threading the chain through the hole was a major challenge, more than I could have ever expected. Once I had the chains in place, it was out with the glue, in this case plastic zap again. And what I did here is really quite simple. After very carefully ladling it and making sure I had as little on the brush as possible, I simply put a big old drop right there on where the hole was to let it sink into position. I got better as this went along. These first ones are a little bit amateurish. Admittedly, didn't anything but perfect, but they certainly did the job. I didn't glue the chain directly to the prime mover because I was afraid the glue spread would actually make it look a little bit too obvious as to the fact that the chain wasn't doing anything, and I just thought this would look more realistic. And it actually came out quite decently, as you see me there putting the second chain in position. Another thing you'll notice is that the second chain actually went through the hole and is extending the way I wanted it to. The first, unfortunately, didn't go quite as smoothly. I would learn how to do this. I would come up with an interesting technique for this a little bit later on, as we'll see. And yes, that was one of the techniques I discovered. Using a styling tweezer of all things I bought off the shelf at Walmart allowed me to get more control of the chain and get it right into position. But I found yet another interesting technique, and using a thumbtack, which we'll see footage of in just a second. And again, I repeated the same steps on the other prime mover. In this case, I got the chain in much better, getting the excess to hang down through the hole so I could cut it down to length to make it look like it was realistically tied in place. And again, once I was sure the chain was nice and taut and in place, I simply took my glue bottle and again applied the plastic zap right to the holes themselves. Again, making sure not to use too much, but still enough to make sure the chain was in place. And here's another unique technique I came up with to get the chain right where I wanted it. I simply used that push pin you see there to hook the chain and pull it through the hole in case it got bunched up in place. This would ensure it hung down and allowed me to get a realistic trim on the bottom, and also allowed me to easily keep it taut. Again, making sure the chain looked very realistic and convincing. And now again, with the chains in the proper position hanging down, it was time to trim them down to proper length. Obviously in real life, if you hung them down, this would cause sparks. Obviously here it looks just plain realistic. So to deal with this again, I just employed my wire snips. Went ahead and just grabbed them and cut them to a realistic length. I was more concerned in this case, if I'm honest, to make sure they just didn't hang down and drag. Is while again this is a model train, they can still hang up on things, and that can create a lot of headaches for you, and not to mention derailments and expensive derailments. Two things I do want to have, which are seem like one of the same, but I believe there are two different types of derailments, but I prefer to have neither, so I was very aggressive in trimming these to get them to the right length. And here we have the finished product. It came out beautifully, as you see. It really is worth the effort, and I'm really kind of happy I was able to find these little components to make this sort of project come to life, something I've been wanting to do for quite some time. And summing up this product, Phantom Hobbies is making a product that many of us didn't know we actually needed or wanted. The fact is, no one really makes a prime mover up until now that would actually be fully assembled and easy to paint and all set to go. In addition to the 12-cylinder one you saw me working with here on the flat car, of course, there's the 16-cylinder 251, as well as the 244 16 and 12-cylinder variations, and I believe also the 567 for the on the EMD side. In short, Phantom Hobbies has you covered. This is a great product. My recommendation is buy it if you're looking to finish that last detailed part for your layout. And as if that wasn't enough, and it really is, the price is also very reasonable at $15. You get a full prime mover and a partial prime mover. This allows one to make some nice scenic decorations for the layout, as well as take on a project like you just saw me do with that flat car. all for a very good price. What I also really enjoyed about this project was finding these little mom and pop outfits that made these little detail parts to make this project come alive. Anyway, that'll do it for this project. If you liked it, please feel free to subscribe. Like of course the thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Thank you for watching, and again, keep the metal side down.